The pilot stopped cold in the aisle, staring hard at the young girl sitting quietly in first class. Passengers turned to watch, feeling tension rise. "You," he said sharply, pointing right at her, "you don't belong here." Little did he know, he'd just challenged someone who owned nearly half the airline. Before we start, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you think everyone should be treated fairly. The airport buzzed with its usual early morning energy, trolleys rolling across polished floors, announcements echoing through the terminal, people rushing past with coffee in one hand and boarding passes in the other. Among them stood Amara Richmond, a quiet, well-dressed teenager holding a first-class ticket. She wasn't loud or flashy, just calm and collected. Her braided hair was neatly pulled back, her phone clutched in one hand, and a backpack resting on her shoulder. It was a big day for her, not just another flight, but a trip to Europe for a youth summit, where she had been invited to speak. It wasn't something she broadcasted to the world. She didn't need to. Amara had been raised with a kind of quiet confidence, not the type that demanded attention, but the kind that stayed steady even when others looked away. She reached her gate a little early and was among the first to board. A gate agent scanned her boarding pass without issue and gave her a polite nod. "First class, welcome aboard," he said. Amara smiled and stepped down the jet bridge. The plane was still half empty, and the air smelled like new carpet and brewed coffee. She found her seat 2A, a window seat with soft lighting and a spacious setup. She settled in, plugged in her phone, and took a deep breath. This flight was just one part of her new chapter, stepping into her own, away from family, doing things that mattered. Outside the aircraft, Captain Dwyer walked through the gate area with a leather flight bag in one hand and a coffee in the other. A tall man in his 50s, he had a reputation for being strict and particular. Crew respected him, but they also tiptoed around him. As he approached the gate, he gave a short nod to the staff and asked, without smiling, "Are we ready?" The agent confirmed boarding had started. The captain moved toward the aircraft, but paused when he glanced at the boarding manifest displayed on the screen. He squinted at one name. "Amara Richmond, seat 2A, he muttered. "That's a mistake." The gate agent raised an eyebrow. "No, sir. She boarded a few minutes ago. First class." Captain Dwyer frowned, but said nothing. As he stepped inside the aircraft, he walked through the first-class cabin, his eyes quickly landing on Amara. She looked up from her phone and offered a polite smile, unaware of the stare she was about to receive. The captain didn't return the smile. He glanced at her ticket still resting on the armrest, then back at her face. Without a word, he continued walking to the cockpit, but his mind was racing. He didn't say anything to the rest of the crew at first, but a few minutes later, as boarding continued, he pulled aside one of the flight attendants. His tone was low, but sharp. "That girl in 2A, who cleared her for that seat?" The attendant was taken aback. "Sir, her ticket says 2A. We didn't have any issue." The captain nodded slowly, then added, "Check again." He didn't say why, and he didn't have to. The unspoken message was clear. She didn't look like she belonged there. The flight attendant, unsure what exactly the captain was implying, returned to the galley but pulled up the manifest again just to be sure. There it was, Amara Richmond, confirmed in seat 2A, no discrepancies, ticket paid in full. The attendant exchanged a glance with a colleague, but said nothing. This wasn't the first time she'd seen Captain Dwyer raise silent doubts about passengers who didn't fit his idea of first class. But most of the time, he kept it subtle. Today felt different. Meanwhile, Amara sat quietly, sipping water from a paper cup and glancing out the window. She'd boarded plenty of flights before, but something about this one felt off. It wasn't anything anyone said, at least not yet. It was the look, the kind you get when someone's sizing you up before they've even spoken to you. She looked down at her phone. A message from her mother was still open on the screen. "Mom, let me know when you're seated. Be calm. You're representing more than just yourself today." Amara smiled faintly. She replied, "Settled in. Everything's fine." Then she locked the screen. At the front of the cabin, Captain Dwyer stepped out of the cockpit again. Boarding had nearly finished. The cabin was filling up, and flight attendants were starting to close overhead bins. He made his way back up the aisle with slow, deliberate steps. When he reached Amara's row, he stopped beside her seat. Passengers nearby paused their conversations. "Young lady," he said, his tone flat, "can I see your boarding pass, please?" Amara blinked, surprised. "Sure," she said, reaching calmly into her bag. She handed it to him. He studied the ticket closely, like it might change if he stared long enough. "How did you get this seat?" he asked. She looked up at him, confused. "I booked it, weeks ago, through the app." He raised an eyebrow, still holding the ticket. "This is a first-class seat." "I know," she said quietly. "That's what I paid for." Passengers started shifting in their seats. Some glanced over. A few pretended not to listen. The silence in the cabin grew heavier. The captain handed her back the ticket. "I'll be back," he said curtly, then turned and walked away. No apology, no explanation. Just a tone that made it clear he wasn't done. The moment he walked off, Amara sat still, trying not to show anything on her face. She'd been through moments like this before, not on a plane, but in school, stores, restaurants, where someone questioned her right to be where she was. Her first instinct always was to stay calm, but the knot in her stomach was familiar, and it was tightening. In the galley, the captain pulled aside the purser. His voice stayed low, but his frustration was obvious. "That girl in 2A. Something isn't adding up. I want her moved. I'm not flying this route with confusion in my cabin." The purser hesitated. "Sir, the manifest is clear. Her seat's legit." Captain Dwyer narrowed his eyes. "She's a teenager flying alone in first class with no visible guardian or business affiliation. Do I need to remind you what our policy is on verifying suspicious bookings?" The purser didn't answer right away. There was no such policy, at least not one written anywhere. But the captain's tone didn't leave much room for argument. The purser gave a short nod and walked off. Back in the cabin, Amara pulled out her headphones, trying to distract herself. But she couldn't ignore the feeling now. The heavy looks, the long pause, the way the captain had questioned her like she was out of place. She knew what this was. She wasn't going to say it out loud, but she didn't need to. Passengers in the surrounding rows were watching. One man in a suit whispered something to the woman beside him. She leaned toward the aisle and glanced at Amara with a small frown before turning away. They didn't say anything to her. No one did. The flight attendant, who had been sent by the purser, came forward slowly. Her face was tight with discomfort. She crouched slightly beside Amara's seat. "Miss Richmond, I'm very sorry, but the captain has asked for additional verification on your ticket. Would you mind stepping off the plane for a moment while we clear it up?" Amara stared at her, her voice low. "My ticket is verified. I've already boarded. I'm not leaving my seat." The attendant kept her voice soft, glancing nervously around. "I understand. I do. But he's insisting." Passengers nearby started whispering again. Amara looked past the flight attendant toward the front of the cabin. The captain wasn't even looking her way. He was back in the cockpit. "I'm not moving," Amara said again, clearly now. "My seat is paid for. I have nothing else to prove." The attendant stood, hesitated, and walked back toward the galley. The pressure in the cabin was growing, and Amara knew this wasn't over. 10 minutes passed. The plane should have been pushing back by now, but it sat still at the gate. The cabin lights remained dimmed, and the engines hadn't started. Passengers began checking their watches, looking around, sensing something wasn't right. A few started asking attendants why the flight was delayed, but no clear answer came. In the cockpit, Captain Dwyer made another call to the gate crew. "I'm delaying departure until we get this sorted," he said flatly. Seat 2A is not verified in my view. Get someone from operations on this." The purser, growing more uneasy, stepped aside and made a quiet call to the airline's regional control office. "We've got an issue," she said, her voice low. "Passenger in 2A is being held up by the captain. There's no system issue. Her name's Amara Richmond. Her seat is confirmed. Captain's insisting." At the same time, Amara had pulled out her phone again. Her hands were steady, but her face was tight. She opened a message thread and typed quickly, "Still at gate. Pilot is refusing to let us leave because of me." She paused, then added, "No mistake. He just doesn't like what he sees." She hit send. The message landed immediately on her mother's phone. Lauren Richmond, co-CEO of the airline. Lauren was already in a morning meeting when she saw the text. She read it once, then again. She didn't reply. Instead, she stepped out of the room and made a direct call, not to the gate, not to customer service, but to the airline's senior flight operations director. Back on the plane, the tension was climbing. A woman in 1D stood up and asked loudly, "Why are we not moving?" A man near row 4 called out, "Are we even taking off today?" Another added, "We saw you hassling that young girl. What's going on?" Flight attendants tried to calm them down, but it wasn't working. The story was already unraveling in whispers. Amara sat still, phone in her hand, eyes forward. She hadn't said a word since the last confrontation. She didn't need to. The cabin was doing the talking now. Then came the tap on the captain's headset, a direct line from executive flight operations. "Captain Dwyer," the voice said clearly, "stand by for a priority instruction regarding passenger 2A." Captain Dwyer stiffened in his seat. Priority instructions didn't come often and never during boarding. He pressed the button on his headset. "Go ahead." "This is from Executive Command," the voice said. "Passenger Amara Richmond is a verified first-class guest. She holds significant ownership in this airline through Richmond Holdings. Any further delay or interference will be logged and reviewed at the executive level." There was a pause on the line. Then, "Do you understand, Captain?" Dwyer didn't respond right away. His jaw clenched. He knew the name Richmond. Everybody in the company did, but he'd never imagined this quiet teenager was that Richmond. It didn't make sense. She didn't look like someone who held boardroom power. She didn't act entitled. She wasn't dressed in any designer label he could recognize. "I understand," he muttered finally, and cut the line. He sat back in silence for a few seconds, then pushed out of the cockpit and stepped into the cabin. His face was composed, but tight. He walked down the aisle again toward seat 2A. Passengers noticed. Several heads turned. The murmurs picked up. Amara looked up calmly, her face unreadable. He stopped beside her row. "Miss Richmond," he said, his tone low, "I want to apologize for the inconvenience." She looked at him without smiling. "Is that why we're still at the gate?" she asked, voice even. The captain hesitated. "There was a misunderstanding about your seat." "No," she said, not raising her voice. "There was no misunderstanding. You didn't like what you assumed about me, and you tried to act on it." Passengers nearby went still. A few looked between the two, waiting to see how he'd respond. Captain Dwyer said nothing, just gave a short nod, then turned and walked back to the cockpit. Amara leaned back in her seat, calm as ever. But the air in the cabin had shifted. People saw what happened now, and some of them were not going to stay quiet about it. The aircraft finally pulled away from the gate. The engine started, and the cabin lights dimmed as the crew prepared for takeoff. But the usual calm before departure wasn't there. The silence had weight. The whispers didn't stop. Passengers weren't just settling in, they were watching. Watching Amara, watching the flight attendants, watching for signs of what just happened and what it meant. Amara stared out the window, the clouds not yet visible, but the sky already hinting at sunrise. She kept her posture steady, her face neutral, but her fingers stayed on her phone. She wasn't typing, just holding it, waiting. In the galley, two flight attendants exchanged glances. The purser, still unsettled, whispered, "That call wasn't just a warning. That was from the top." Her colleague nodded. "She's not just a passenger. She's tied to ownership." "She's Richmond's daughter?" the younger attendant asked. "Seems like it," and the captain tried to get her off the plane. They didn't say more, but the message hung in the air. What the captain had done wasn't procedural, it was personal, and now everyone knew it. Up front, Captain Dwyer sat rigid in the cockpit. His co-pilot, a younger man who hadn't said much until now, glanced over and said quietly, "You didn't know who she was?" Dwyer didn't answer at first. Didn't matter who she was. She looked out of place. The younger pilot stared at him, taken aback. She had a first-class ticket. "I've seen fake bookings before, teenagers trying to game the system. I didn't know she was—" He trailed off. The excuse sounded thin even to him. Back in first class, the service began. A tray of drinks came down the aisle, but when it reached Amara, the attendant paused. "Miss Richmond," she said gently, "would you like something to drink?" Amara didn't smile. "Water's fine." The attendant nodded and moved quickly to get it. When she returned, she leaned in a little closer, her voice soft. "I'm sorry about earlier. Some of us saw what happened. Not everyone here agrees with how that was handled." Amara met her eyes. "Thanks," she said quietly, "but I'm used to it." The words hit harder than they sounded. The attendant swallowed, nodded again, and stepped away. Across the aisle, a man who had watched the whole thing leaned over. He looked like a businessman, mid-40s, clean-cut, wearing an expensive watch. "Excuse me," he said low enough so only Amara could hear. "You handled that with a lot more calm than I would have. I don't think I would have stayed seated." Amara gave him a short look, then shrugged. "I don't let people like him decide how I carry myself." He gave a half-smile. Still, that was something. As the plane climbed, the seatbelt signs blinked off, and the cabin settled into the steady hum of a long flight. But the tension didn't disappear. It stayed, quiet but alive. People kept glancing toward the front, toward Amara, and toward the man flying the plane. Amara opened her phone again. This time, it wasn't a message. It was a news app. She knew how fast things moved when people talked. If someone had filmed part of the exchange, and she had seen at least one phone aimed her way, it would already be out there. She typed her name in the search bar. Nothing yet. But it was only a matter of time. 2 hours into the flight, the cabin lights were dimmed, and most passengers had settled into movies or naps. The energy had calmed, but the memory of the morning still lingered. It hadn't been loud or dramatic, but it left a mark, especially for those who saw it unfold firsthand. Amara hadn't slept. She sat upright, headphones in, but no music playing. Her phone screen stayed lit with a message thread still open. Her mother hadn't replied yet. That didn't worry her. She knew what silence meant. It meant things were being handled, quietly, from the top. She turned her head and caught a glimpse of the curtain that separated first class from the cockpit. It hadn't moved since takeoff. No updates from the captain, no announcements from him either. Just silence. The purser returned with a tray and stopped beside Amara again. "We have lunch coming up," she said gently. "Would you like to see the options?" Amara looked up and nodded. "Sure." As the purser handed her the menu, she hesitated. "We've also arranged a small gesture from the company. Complimentary onboard internet for the duration of your flight. Just log in under your name." Amara raised her eyebrows slightly. "Thanks." The attendant gave a small nod and walked away. Amara turned back to her screen, logged in, connected. And there it was, first headline in her feed from a small aviation news blog. "Passenger in first class allegedly targeted by pilot on domestic flight. Conflict raises questions." No names yet, no details. But it was spreading. She scrolled further, a blurry photo from someone in row 3. You could see the back of her head, and the captain standing beside her. A Reddit thread was already going. Did anyone else see what happened on Flight 2283? Pilot tried to remove a teenage girl from first class. He backed off when she stood her ground. Amara exhaled slowly. She wasn't surprised. People had been filming. The flight crew probably didn't realize how many cameras were on them. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Dwyer got a quiet tap on the shoulder from the co-pilot. "Sir, you might want to check your messages," Dwyer frowned. He opened the flight operations tablet that synced with airline systems. A new internal alert was flashing in red. "Executive oversight request, Flight 2283. Status flagged for incident review upon landing. Report expected from flight captain and purser." The captain's hand froze on the screen. He tapped into the message, scanned it, then sat back. The word review carried weight. He'd been flying for over 20 years and had only been flagged once before, for a mechanical delay. This wasn't that. He didn't say anything. But his shoulders were tight now. He knew he'd made a mistake. What bothered him more was that it wasn't going away quietly. Someone up top wasn't letting it slide. And he had a growing suspicion exactly who that was. Another hour passed. Lunch trays had been cleared, lights were dimmed again, and the plane cruised steadily above the Atlantic. Most passengers drifted into sleep or movies, but Amara stayed alert. She hadn't touched the in-flight entertainment. Her eyes stayed on her phone, flipping between articles and messages. New headlines were popping up every half hour. One had already named the airline, another used the phrase racial profiling in the skies. The comment sections were starting to fill, people angry, sharing their own stories, tagging the airline's account. Some praised Amara for standing her ground, others wanted names. It was moving faster than she'd expected. She refreshed her inbox. One new message, from her mother, Lauren Richmond. "I spoke to the board chair. Sit tight. Your landing will not be quiet." Amara read the line twice. Short, direct, and enough to confirm what she already suspected. This was now bigger than just her. It wasn't about the seat anymore. It was about the captain. About how many times this had happened quietly, and how many times people like her had been forced to leave the plane, told it was a misunderstanding, and then ignored. Back in the galley, the purser received a discreet message on her crew device. She read it twice, then turned to her colleague with a nervous look. "We've been asked to prepare for executive presence on the ground," she whispered. "Someone high up is meeting the plane." Her colleague frowned. "Someone from ops?" She shook her head. "Number Richmond. Herself." The attendant's face changed. "The mother?" "Yeah, her and 2 board members, waiting on the tarmac." They looked toward Amara, who hadn't moved from her seat. She didn't look powerful. She didn't look angry. Just quiet, focused. But now they knew. She wasn't just anyone. In the cockpit, the tension had settled into silence. Dwyer had stopped speaking completely. His co-pilot glanced over now and then, but didn't say a word. The atmosphere had changed, no longer professional, just cold. The captain had checked his messages too. He'd seen the same alerts, knew who was waiting when they landed. And it wasn't just PR or operations. It was Lauren Richmond, co-owner of the airline, and mother of the girl he'd tried to remove. He sat rigid, hands resting on the controls, but his thoughts were loud. He replayed the scene again and again. How sure he'd been, how quick he was to judge, how casually he'd tried to push her off that plane. No apology, no explanation, just assumption. Now that assumption was going to cost him, maybe everything. As the hours slipped by and the cabin grew quiet, Amara remained still, her mind sharp despite the fatigue. She didn't need to guess how this would end. She'd grown up watching boardrooms, negotiations, and press statements. She knew how her mother operated, calm, measured, but unshakable when it mattered. And when it came to Amara, it always mattered. She glanced around the cabin. Some passengers were asleep, but a few still watched her with curiosity. One older woman across the aisle gave her a quiet nod, not pity, but something closer to recognition, a kind of silent respect. Amara gave a slight nod back. Another notification buzzed her phone. A trending post showed a still from the incident, blurry but unmistakable. The headline read, "Black teen passenger harassed by pilot over first-class seat. Turns out she's a major shareholder." Underneath were screenshots of old press releases confirming her family's investment in the airline. The story had broken wide open. At the rear of the cabin, a crew member walked back to the galley, tapping a device that synced to airport communications. A soft tone alerted the team that VIP ground presence had been confirmed. When they landed, the aircraft would taxi to a remote area away from the regular terminal. Executive vehicles would be waiting on the tarmac. Security detail had already been assigned. Word passed quickly through the crew, though not spoken out loud. The shift in their behavior was visible, more careful, more deliberate. No more hushed jokes, no more side glances. The purser made one more pass through first class. She paused at Amara's seat. "We'll be starting descent soon. If you need anything before landing, anything at all, let me know." Amara looked at her, polite but distant. "I'm fine." The purser hesitated. "You'll be met upon arrival. We've been informed." "I know," Amara said simply. At the front, Dwyer had received the same message. His eyes scanned the screen in front of him as if reading it might change the outcome. But it didn't. The names were there: Lauren Richmond, 2 board directors, legal counsel. They were waiting, and they weren't waiting to chat. The co-pilot glanced at him again. "You want me to make the landing announcement?" Dwyer shook his head. "Number, I'll do it." He flipped on the intercom. His voice came over the cabin speakers, steady but flat. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We'll be beginning our descent shortly. We're arriving slightly behind schedule. Thank you for your patience, and we'll be on the ground soon." He switched it off and stared ahead. The plane began its slow descent through the clouds, but the real turbulence hadn't started yet, not for him. The aircraft glided smoothly onto the runway, tires thudding softly against the tarmac. Inside the cabin, seatbelts clicked and phones lit up as passengers prepared to disembark. But the usual shuffle of bags and jackets didn't start. The plane wasn't taxiing toward the terminal. It was turning, rolling toward a private access point off to the side. Passengers noticed. Heads turned. A murmur moved through the cabin. "Are we at a hangar? Why aren't we going to the gate?" Through the windows, a sleek black SUV came into view, flanked by 2 smaller security vehicles. The airline logo was discreet on the door, but the presence was clear. This wasn't standard protocol. Amara sat motionless. She knew exactly who was inside. The plane came to a halt, and the intercom crackled again. This time, it wasn't the captain. It was the purser. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We have a short hold before disembarkation. We appreciate your patience." That was it. No explanation, just a request to wait. The front cabin doors opened slowly. A gust of air swept in, followed by the sound of quiet but purposeful footsteps on the metal boarding stairs. A shadow appeared in the doorway first, then a woman in a tailored black coat stepped through, calm, controlled, but unmistakably in charge. Lauren Richmond. She scanned the cabin briefly, not for her daughter, she already knew where she was, but for the man who had caused the delay. Her eyes stopped when they found the cockpit door. She turned to the flight attendant by the galley. "Tell Captain Dwyer, I need to speak with him, now." The attendant didn't hesitate. She knocked once, opened the door, and leaned in. "Captain, she's here." Dwyer stood slowly. His face had lost all color. The moment was real now. He stepped out into the cabin, buttoned his jacket, and walked forward. Every step felt heavier than the last. He stopped a few feet from Lauren, who didn't speak at first. She looked at him with the kind of silence that was far more cutting than anger. Then she said quietly, "Do you know who I am?" "Yes, ma'am," he replied, his voice tight. "And do you know who you tried to remove from this flight?" He nodded once, his eyes not meeting hers. "I don't want your apology," she said. "I want your explanation." Passengers in first class were now fully tuned in. No one moved. No one spoke. Amara remained seated, watching from her row. Dwyer tried to answer, his voice low. There was confusion about the seat. "There was no confusion," she interrupted, her tone flat. "There was profiling. There was assumption, and there was a complete lack of professionalism." He swallowed hard but didn't respond. She continued, not raising her voice. "This airline has survived because people like my daughter and I invested when no one else would. You've flown under our name for years. Today, you decided she didn't belong." Silence. "You'll step off this aircraft now," she said, "and you will not return to active duty until further notice." Dwyer opened his mouth like he wanted to push back, but there was nothing to say, not to her. He gave a stiff nod, turned, and walked off the plane, his footsteps slow and heavy. No eye contact with the passengers, no glance at Amara. As he disappeared down the stairs, the tension in the cabin finally broke. A few people whispered. A few just sat still, unsure what they'd just witnessed. But Amara knew exactly what it was: accountability. Once Captain Dwyer was off the plane, the atmosphere inside shifted, but not into relief, more like stunned silence. The man who had walked the aisles earlier, questioning Amara's right to be there with quiet certainty, was now gone. No dramatic exit, no words, just the slow shuffle of someone who knew he'd crossed a line that couldn't be undone. Lauren didn't follow him. She stood for a moment, letting his absence settle in the air, then turned and walked to her daughter. The aisle parted for her without a word. No one dared stop her or speak. When she reached Amara, she crouched slightly to meet her eye level. The mother's sharpness softened, but just a little. "You all right?" she asked, her voice low but steady. Amara nodded. "I'm fine." Lauren studied her for a beat longer. She could read Amara's face better than anyone. She saw the fatigue around her eyes, the tension in her shoulders, and the way she hadn't touched her phone since the landing. She was holding herself together, but it had cost her. "You didn't deserve any of that," Lauren said. "And you didn't do anything wrong." "I know," Amara said quietly. Lauren stood upright again, composed as ever. She looked over her shoulder and gave a short nod to the executive team waiting near the galley. One of them stepped forward, a tall man in a navy suit with an airline badge clipped to his pocket. He cleared his throat. "Miss Richmond," he said, addressing Amara directly now, "we'd like to formally apologize for what happened today. An internal review has already begun. You should never have been questioned, delayed, or disrespected by anyone on this aircraft." Amara looked up at him. "I'm not interested in statements," she said calmly. "I'm interested in whether this only gets addressed because of who I am, or if it gets fixed for the people who won't have someone waiting at the bottom of the stairs." The man nodded slowly. "It's a fair question, and it's one we have to answer with action." Lauren spoke again. "We'll be reviewing the last 2 years of passenger incident logs. Every report flagged under security concerns or seat verification will be examined. Quiet removals, missed upgrades, delays, especially those involving minors or solo black travelers. We'll be going back through every one." The flight attendants nearby looked up, slightly stunned. That wasn't protocol. That was a full sweep, a signal that this wasn't going to be buried. A few rows behind, a woman quietly started clapping. It was slow, uncertain, but then another person joined in, and then a few more. It wasn't loud or forced, just a soft ripple of recognition, not for spectacle, but for the moment. Amara didn't stand or wave. She just looked down at her hands for a second, then back out the window. Her expression didn't change, but her shoulders relaxed slightly. The purser returned with the disembarkation instructions. But this time, the crew didn't address the passengers as a whole. They came to Amara first. "We'll let you and your mother exit privately through the service stairs," she said, voice softer than before. "Your luggage is already being moved to the SUV." Amara stood, slipped her phone into her bag, and turned to the aisle. As she walked, passengers moved aside, not with pity, but respect. A few nodded. One older man said quietly, "Good for you." She didn't say anything back, but she nodded once as she passed. Outside, the tarmac was quiet, except for the soft hum of the SUV's engine. The sun was beginning to set. Amara stepped into the car with her mother beside her, the door closed behind them, and for the first time since that morning, she leaned back into the seat and let her body rest. Lauren glanced over. "You want to speak to press?" Amara thought about it, then shook her head. "Not yet." Lauren nodded. "When you're ready. Until then, we'll handle it." The SUV pulled away from the aircraft, the runway stretching behind them. And with it, the silence that had followed Amara for hours finally started to break. Not because she raised her voice, but because she hadn't let anyone lower hers. The SUV moved slowly down the service road, away from the aircraft and toward the private terminal. Inside, Amara sat with her arms crossed loosely, her gaze fixed out the window. Her reflection stared back at her, superimposed over the darkening tarmac and distant runway lights. She wasn't replaying the confrontation anymore. That part was over. Now she was thinking about what came next. Lauren, seated beside her, was silent. She didn't rush to speak. She knew her daughter, how she processed things quietly first, choosing her words with care. But she also knew when to step in. "You did everything right today," she said. "I know you don't need to hear that, but I'm saying it anyway." Amara didn't look at her. "I know I did. That's the part that never changes." Lauren nodded slowly. "It's not the first time someone's judged you on sight, and I can't pretend it'll be the last. But it might be the last time someone gets to do it while wearing our uniform." Amara turned her head then. "Do you really think it'll matter? That anything will change for people who don't have your number saved in their phone?" Lauren met her gaze. "It'll matter because this time someone with a platform is speaking, and because you didn't just take the seat, you kept it." The SUV pulled up to the terminal entrance. Two staff members opened the doors, offering quiet greetings. Inside, another vehicle was already waiting to take them to the hotel. As they stepped out, a man in a dark suit approached, tablet in hand. "Ms. Richmond," he said, addressing Lauren, "we've compiled the footage from the aircraft. 2 passengers have already submitted phone recordings, and the flight crew's body cam feed confirms the full exchange." Lauren didn't need to look at the screen. "Send everything to compliance, legal, and comms. I want a preliminary report by morning." Amara stayed back as they spoke, absorbing the weight of what was happening. Her name, her face, this wasn't just a moment anymore. It was evidence. It would become headlines, maybe policy. But it didn't feel like power. It felt like pressure. They entered the private terminal's lounge, where bottled water and quiet music tried to soften the air. Amara sat on the edge of a leather chair, not relaxing into it. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a friend, someone from school. "Girl, what did you do? You're everywhere. They said you shut down a captain." She stared at the message, thumbs hovering over the screen. Then she typed slowly, "I didn't shut him down. He did that to himself. I just didn't move." She locked the phone and placed it face down on the table. Across the room, Lauren was already on a call with the legal team, her voice calm and direct as she reviewed timelines and statements. Amara could hear phrases like formal inquiry, discrimination protocol, and captain removal policy. She knew her mother wasn't letting this fade out with an apology and a press release. A staff member approached quietly with a folder. "The board has asked for Amara's input if she's willing. On the next stage, training, internal messaging. The full scope. Lauren looked over at her daughter. "Your call." Amara didn't answer right away. She sat with the offer in the air, feeling the weight of it settle, not just as the victim of what happened, but as someone with a stake in what came next. "I'll think about it," she said finally. "I want to be involved, but not as someone giving a statement." Lauren nodded. "We'll write it on your terms." And that's what stuck with Amara, not just that people now knew who she was, but that she could decide how this story ended. Not as the girl questioned for taking a seat in first class, but as the one who changed what that seat meant for everyone else who'd ever been told, "You don't belong here." By the next morning, the headlines had fully taken hold. What began as a few posts and blurry images had evolved into a national story. News outlets framed it with terms like mid-air discrimination, racial profiling by pilot, and shareholder's daughter humiliated aboard her own airline. But beneath the buzz, the real story was sharper, cleaner. A girl with every right to her seat was told by a uniformed authority that she didn't belong, and she refused to move. Amara stayed quiet through most of the media storm. No interviews, no public statements, not yet. While journalists speculated and commenters praised or argued in threads online, she spent the morning reading internal reports sent to her through secure channels. Lauren had insisted that Amara be given full access, not as a symbolic gesture, but as a shareholder. Her name was on the paperwork. Her voice had weight. The flight crew logs confirmed everything: the time the captain flagged the seat, the instruction he gave to delay the departure, the record of Amara's boarding pass being valid, cleared, and logged without issue. All facts, no gaps to twist. One line in the report caught her attention more than the rest. A quote from the captain during a crew conversation before departure: "First class should look like first class, not like a high school field trip." Amara stared at the sentence for a while. She read it 3 times. Then she closed the file. Later that afternoon, she walked into a private conference room at the airline's headquarters. A dozen people were seated around the table: department heads, legal advisors, communications staff, HR. Her mother sat at the far end, but didn't speak. This was Amara's meeting. The room went still when she entered. She took a seat at the center, looked up, and spoke plainly. "Here's what I want changed," she said. No preamble, no emotional speech, just a list. Mandatory anti-bias training for flight staff, starting within 30 days. All security-triggered seat disputes to be reviewed within 48 hours by a human oversight panel, not just automated systems. Passenger removal procedures to require a second officer's review when no behavior or threat is present. Transparency. Every passenger asked to move without clear cause should receive written explanation. And lastly, clarity for staff. Not just what they shouldn't do, but what they're expected to stand up against. No one interrupted. No one looked away. They all knew this wasn't just a PR response. It was a directive. Lauren finally spoke from the end of the table. "And we'll release the findings publicly. Not because we have to, but because if we're going to repair this, it has to be visible." There were nods around the room, some hesitant, most firm. Amara sat back in her chair. She wasn't angry anymore. She was done proving she belonged. Now it was about making sure no one else had to do the same, just to sit in a seat they paid for. And everyone in the room understood. This wasn't about damage control. This was about structural correction, the kind that sticks. 2 days later, the airline issued its first official public statement. It didn't follow the usual script. No vague references to an unfortunate misunderstanding or an isolated incident. This one named what happened, and it named who it happened to. On Flight 2283, a verified first-class passenger, Amara Richmond, was wrongly challenged and delayed by the acting captain due to a personal judgment that violated both our values and policies. Miss Richmond is not only a shareholder in this company, she is a passenger entitled to dignity and equal treatment. The captain involved, has been placed on indefinite leave pending further review. A company-wide training initiative on anti-bias conduct is being launched immediately, alongside updated internal oversight procedures for in-flight seat disputes. The statement went live across the airline's website, social channels, and partner media outlets, and within minutes it started spreading. Amara sat at home when she saw it go up. She didn't repost it, didn't comment on it, but she read every word, twice. It didn't fix what happened, but it made it clear the company wasn't hiding it. Her phone started ringing more than usual. Friends, classmates, distant cousins, even a few former teachers reaching out to say they'd seen her name in the news. Some were supportive. A few offered to help write posts or draft a public response. She politely declined all of it. She wasn't interested in going viral. Across social media, though, her story took off anyway, not just as a scandal, but as a symbol. People shared their own stories in response. I was kicked off a flight for being too disruptive after questioning a seat change. My daughter was moved from business class after boarding because the crew said she'd be more comfortable elsewhere. Her inbox filled with stories from strangers, some long, some raw. All similar in one way: they had felt powerless, and they hadn't fought back because no one had been watching. But now people were watching. The airline's leadership, already under pressure, moved quickly. Within 72 hours, they released a timeline of internal policy updates. For the first time in the company's history, passengers would have access to a public reporting tool for discriminatory conduct. Anonymous submissions allowed, real follow-ups promised. Internally, staff briefings were held at every hub. Crew received memos with updated protocols, and every team lead was required to sign an acknowledgement that discrimination, subtle or direct, would be treated as a safety violation, not just a customer service issue. Amara didn't attend the briefings. She didn't need to. Her presence was already in every document, every policy draft, every shift in how the company talked about accountability. Her name wasn't just on the boarding pass now, it was on the change itself. And as all of this moved forward, she stayed quiet, still watching, still processing, but no longer waiting to be seen. It wasn't until the end of that week that Amara finally agreed to speak publicly. Not with a camera crew, not on a morning talk show, but at a small internal summit organized by the airline's leadership team. It was closed door. Just executives, senior staff, and representatives from every department: operations, flight crews, customer experience, and HR. Amara walked into the room alone. No security, no media, just her and the people who made decisions that shaped how others were treated. At 35,000 feet, they gave her the floor. She didn't stand at a podium. She didn't read from notes. She just spoke, calmly, clearly, and without ceremony. I was in seat 2A. The ticket was valid. The name was mine. The captain saw me and decided something wasn't right. Not because of any behavior, not because of a system issue, but because of how I looked. You all know that part already. She paused, letting the room settle. What I need you to understand is that I wasn't surprised. I was used to it. That's the worst part. It didn't shock me. It just made me tired. She looked around. No one interrupted. No one looked away. This wasn't about me being rich or related to the board. That's the only reason it made the news. But if I didn't have my last name, if my mother hadn't made a call, I would have been escorted off that flight, and no one would have questioned it. She took a slow breath. Don't train your staff to handle incidents like this better. Train them to stop creating them, and don't teach them how to apologize. Teach them how not to assume. She ended there, no applause, no dramatic exit. She walked out the same way she came in, quiet, composed, and fully in control. Later that evening, Lauren sat across from her daughter at their kitchen table. No business talk this time. Just 2 plates of takeout between them, and a quiet moment finally free of statements and reports. You spoke like someone who'd been carrying that for a long time, Lauren said. Amara shrugged lightly. I have. You said what needed to be said. I said what I could say, Amara replied. Now I want to see what they'll do. And that, more than anything, was where her strength lay, not in her story, but in how she used it, not to center herself, but to shift the weight of silence off others who had carried it for years with no seat, no voice, and no platform to name what had happened to them. The changes didn't take months, they started that week. Every flight attendant received a revised crew handbook with a new section labeled plainly bias, judgment, and passenger rights. The first line read, "Doubt should never outweigh dignity. If you question a passenger's presence, question your reason." Supervisors held mandatory meetings across regional hubs. The incident with Amara wasn't mentioned by name in the material, but nobody needed it to be. Everyone knew. Some rolled their eyes, some stayed quiet. But many, especially the younger staff, read the changes carefully. They'd seen things like this happen. Now, for the first time, there were consequences. The captain's case was still under review, but internally, most assumed he wouldn't return. No one had heard from him. His silence was just another shadow in a long history of things swept away when no one powerful had been involved. But this time, the silence wasn't enough. Everyone was watching. Back at headquarters, Amara was asked to sit in on an advisory panel, not as a token, not for optics, but to directly shape the language used in training content. She said yes, but with one condition. Don't make it a case study, make it policy. She didn't want her name turned into an example for corporate storytelling. She wanted what happened to be something that couldn't happen again. Meanwhile, the public reaction hadn't cooled. It had shifted. Where the initial headlines had focused on her identity, teen shareholder targeted by airline staff, the newer conversations were broader. Podcasts, articles, and panels used the incident as a launch point to talk about deeper, older problems. One commentator said it clearly, "This story matters not because she was rich or connected, but because someone with power finally experienced what too many others already have and didn't look away." Amara didn't comment on any of it. She read some articles, ignored most, and stayed focused on what she could control. She kept attending the policy meetings, reviewing drafts, asking hard questions. She didn't raise her voice, but she didn't let anything slide. Even within the company, her role started to shift. People referred to her less as the daughter of the co-CEO and more as someone shaping future practice. Staff emailed her directly. Some thanked her. Some shared their own experiences. Quiet, uncomfortable moments on flights, in lounges, during check-ins. Many of them ended their notes the same way. "I didn't say anything at the time. I wish I had." Amara replied to every single one, not with advice, just acknowledgement. You don't owe anyone a scene. You just deserve not to be tested to prove you belong. It wasn't a campaign. It wasn't a movement. It was something simpler, but deeper. A shift in how people inside the company saw passengers like her, and how people like her saw themselves. Not out of place, not exceptions, just present and staying. Weeks passed, and the noise around the incident began to fade from the headlines, but inside the airline, the impact stayed. The new training modules went live across all flight teams, not watered down, not optional. Amara had reviewed every word. She insisted on language that was blunt, not polished. Examples in the training weren't abstract. They described specific behaviors, the quiet redirections, the extra checks, the second glances. Things that didn't come with slurs or raised voices, but still carried the same message: you don't belong here. During one of the early sessions, a junior flight attendant in Miami raised his hand and said, "I've seen this happen. I've done it too, honestly. Not like that captain did. But I've made calls based on nothing but a gut feeling. This training feels personal." His supervisor didn't scold him, just nodded. "It's supposed to." Up in the corporate office, Amara stayed involved, but not front-facing. She declined every media interview and bypassed every speaking invite. She wasn't interested in becoming a symbol. She didn't want to be followed around with microphones asking how it felt. She already knew how it felt. What mattered now was what came next. One day, she met with the internal HR leads to discuss the case backlog, passenger complaints from the last 5 years that had been marked resolved without action. She sat at the head of the table, flipping through case files quietly. A few minutes in, she looked up and said, "How many of these were closed because someone didn't escalate the issue?" A manager replied, "Most of them. If the passenger didn't push, the crew was usually given the benefit of the doubt." "From now on," Amara said, "passengers shouldn't have to escalate anything to be believed." No one argued. The room just nodded and took notes. In her downtime, Amara finally took another flight, this time on a smaller regional route, alone again, but with no fanfare. No announcement, just a regular ticket, booked quietly under a different name. She wanted to see how things felt, unfiltered, no protection. She boarded without issue, sat in first class. The flight attendant smiled and offered her a drink before takeoff. No hesitation, no second glance. It was a short flight, just under 2 hours, uneventful, peaceful. But when she landed, she opened her phone and typed a short message to her mother. No questions, no delays, nothing weird. It felt normal. Lauren replied 5 minutes later. Good. Normal is what should have happened the first time. Amara stared at the screen for a while. She wasn't smiling, just still. She didn't need gratitude or applause. What she needed was to keep that silence, the kind that comes from being left alone when you've done nothing wrong. And for the first time, it felt like maybe that silence could last. Months later, the incident had faded from public conversation, replaced by newer headlines and fresher outrage. But inside the airline, the changes it sparked remained active, permanent, and visible. Not just in policy documents or press kits, but in how people behaved, how they moved, how they thought before they acted. Flight crews began to notice the difference, not all at once, but gradually. Fewer assumptions, more questions asked quietly, instead of conclusions drawn loudly. New hires were trained under the updated protocol, and veterans were reminded through real consequences that habit didn't excuse harm. The captain, Dwyer, was quietly removed from his position. No ceremony, no public statement. He was given a severance and a formal letter explaining the basis of his dismissal. Misconduct rooted in personal bias. It wasn't revenge. It was accountability. Amara didn't ask for updates. She didn't follow the fallout. That part of the story no longer belonged to her. What mattered was that it didn't repeat. Her life moved forward. She returned to school, resumed travel for the youth summit, and stayed involved with the advisory team, not because it was expected, but because she had something to say, and people finally understood it wasn't optional to listen. At the end of the year, the airline published its annual report. Buried deep in the document, beyond the graphs and forecasts, was a brief section titled Equity and Passenger Rights, Outcomes and Changes. It listed revisions made, training hours logged, complaints reclassified, and staff accountability actions. At the bottom was a single sentence. These reforms began after a passenger in seat 2A refused to move. No name, no speech, no headline, just the truth. Amara saw the report while waiting for a connecting flight, sitting alone near a quiet gate. She read the sentence, closed the page, and put the device down. She looked out at the runway, planes rising into the sky one after another. No one stared. No one questioned her. No one asked her to prove she was supposed to be there. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't waiting to be treated fairly. She already was.